Greetings, beautiful people. Making another content video. So I'm still working on chapter one, and it is Labor Day weekend. It's Friday, so I'm assuming that a lot of you won't see this video till next week. But I decided I'm gonna try to batch and finish up chapter one and maybe even get started on chapter two. So in chapter one, the next part that I really want to talk about is how do psychologists ask and answer questions. I really would encourage you to read the section titled Why Do Psychology? Because I have my opinions about why you should study psychology because it's totally awesome. But in your textbook, they talk about overconfidence. They talk about the errors that people can make when they just rely on intuition. Okay. And there's tons of different biases: implicit bias, explicit bias, um, hindsight bias, tons of different stuff. And so there's lots of reasons why we need to use science to ask and answer questions about human thinking and human behaving. And so that's what psychology is. So in this next section titled How Do Psychologists Ask and Answer Questions? Um, the main three things I'm going to mention are descriptive research studies, correlational research, and then experimental research. And I know I'm going pretty quick, but there's tons of information available for you in your course textbook and also online. And if you're following along in Canvas, I've linked some videos for you to, explore these topics in a little bit more depth. But in terms of the descriptive research, just think of it like this. If you were a psychologist, right? So you're a scientist who studies human thinking and human behaving. You have to rely on the scientific method. So there's a specific way to ask and answer questions. You need to use a system. You need to try to be objective. All right. Now, descriptive research studies have the goal of describing behavior mental processes, right? Descriptive research, describe. So there's lots of different descriptive studies. You have case studies, you have naturalistic observation, laboratory observation, you have the survey method. All these are ways that you can gather information where you can investigate a phenomena, right? You can learn about human thinking and human behaving, and you're doing it in a way that you can't necessarily say that you can establish a cause and effect relationship. You might be able to, but not really. But you can definitely describe what you see, what you hear, what someone felt. So with descriptive studies, think of it as different techniques you use at a base level to understand why people do what they do and think the way they think. And there's different categories or types or techniques associated with descriptive research. So, like I said, the case study method, most of you have been to a doctor at some point in your life. And if you've been multiple times or you've been to the dentist multiple times, they have a folder. And in that folder, they have gathered all this information about you, right? This is an example of like a case study. When you do a case study, you're exploring a person or phenomena in depth, in detail. And so you're trying to gather as much information as you can. Think back to good old Sigmund Freud when he had his clients come in and lay on the couch and spill their guts, talk. He was compiling data about them, collecting information about them, and he was using this case study method. All right. With the naturalistic observation, it is just what it sounds like. You're watching people in their natural habitat. So maybe going to Walmart and people watching. That would be an example of a naturalistic observation. Now, I'm simplifying my description of these different techniques. Obviously, you want to be much more strategic with how you go about asking and answering questions when you actually employ these techniques. But as long as you understand the gist of it, I think you'll be okay for our purposes. All right, with the survey, it's fast and dirty. You can ask lots of questions to a lot of people and get information in a short amount of time, but there are some drawbacks. For instance, people might lie, or the way you word the question, even the way you present the information, people might respond differently depending on how you present the information. So there's drawbacks and there's advantages to every type of research study. You want to always think about that. So descriptive studies, describing behavior and mental processes. The next thing we mentioned was correlational research. And I really could do an entire video on correlation, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. Think about correlational research as you are trying to use math to find out if two variables, in some cases more than two variables, but two or more variables are connected. Are they related? Okay. Now you're not trying to find out if this variable caused that variable. You just want to know if these variables are related, if they're connected to one another. So when you do correlation research, you're going to get a correlation coefficient. And that coefficient is represented by the letter R. And R can range anywhere from 0 to 1.0. If R is 0, that means there's no connection. There's no relationship between these two variables. If R is 1.0, that means there's a perfect relationship. Now, 1 could be positive or negative, and that's not good or bad. It means that you could have a direct relationship where both variables are going in the same direction, so both up or both down, or you could have a negative relationship where one is going up and one is going down. So let's take an example, such as height and weight. Now, to find out if height and weight were truly correlated, we'd have to gather some information and basically put it into our formula and solve for R, and then we would find out what R is. And if R was close to 1.0, and if it was positive, we could say, aha, look, there's a connection between height and weight. If it was positive, we would say, the taller you are, the more you weigh, or the shorter you are, the less you weigh. Now, if it was a negative correlation, it would be the taller you are, the less you weigh, or the shorter you are, the more you weigh. That's if it was negative. But if you think about it, it's usually the more you weigh, the taller you are. Anyway, like I said, you'd actually have to gather the data, put it into your formula, and solve for R. Because remember, correlational research is a statistical way of showing the connection between two or more variables. And variables are simply things you want to study that you change or convert into numbers, right? So if I want to study height, I have to be able to represent height in numerical form. I want to study weight, I have to be able to represent it in numerical form. If I want to study aggression, I'd have to represent it in numerical form. If I want to study self-esteem, I'd have to represent it in numerical form. So think about that. If I want to study aggression, I could operationally define aggression, or in other words, say that I'm measuring aggression by how many times someone punches someone else in the face or punches someone else in a certain time span, right? So I'm changing it into a numerical form. I could also say I'm going to define aggression by the score that someone gets on a scale that measures aggression. Okay? So anyway, when you do this correlational research, it's mathematics meets psychology. And you're talking about finding out if R is positive or negative, and if it's 0, meaning weak, no relationship, or strong, 1.0. Okay? So we have descriptive studies describing behavior and mental processes, i.e., case studies, surveys, observation. You have correlational research. You're trying to find out if two things correlate, two things are connected. And then you have the gold standard, which is the formal experiment. And with the formal experiment, this is where you're trying to see if X caused Y. Okay, you're trying to find if there's a causal relationship between your variables of interest. Okay, so I'm probably going to do a separate video on any of these topics and make it a little bit more formal, because I know I'm being very loosey-goosey here, but I really just want you to understand it. So I'm trying to change it into everyday language. All right, so with the formal experiment, now you're trying to find out if doing this thing caused that. So to do experimental research, you're going to have some control as the researcher. Okay, so you have to have more control or power. You are going to manipulate one variable, not the people, not the subjects, but a variable. All right, and the variable that you manipulate, that you control, is called your independent variable. The variable that you measure is called the dependent variable. It's also called the dependent measure. So you're trying to say that the independent variable caused the dependent variable. The dependent variable is dependent on the manipulations of the independent variable. So the independent variable is what the researcher controls or manipulates, and the dependent variable is what's measured. So if you were studying the effects of lighting, or if I was studying the effects of lighting on test performance, I could say I'm going to put students into 3 conditions. One condition where they study in complete darkness with no light, the absence of light. Other students are going to study with very bright light, extremely bright light. And then other students are going to study with moderate light. Now, the moderate light group is similar to everyday conditions, so that would be considered the control group, all right? The standard or baseline group that we're comparing the other groups against. The bright light and the no light group are considered the experimental groups. Now notice, all three groups are relatively the same at the start of the experiment. The only difference between the students in the bright light, no light, and the moderate light is the IV, independent variable, which is light. I'm manipulating light. All right. Now, because we said the IV is the cause, the DV is the effect. So we're trying to say that lighting caused the test performance. So all students, after studying in their respective lighting conditions, would then be given a test, and their score on the test would tell me whether or not, studying in that lighting condition helped or hurt their performance. All right. So the score on the test would be the DV, or dependent measure. Right. All right. So I hope that makes sense. You could say that the lighting caused the test score. All right. There's other things to consider with the formal experiment, but you definitely want to be aware of the difference between independent and dependent variable. You also want to know that using random assignment is desirable. You want to use random assignment. The purpose of using random assignment is that if you use random assignment, you're ensuring, or you're hoping to ensure, that at the start of the experiment, all of the individuals in your group are relatively the same, and you just randomly put them into one of the conditions in your study. And so the only differences between the groups is the variable that you're controlling, that you're manipulating, your independent variable. All right. The rest of the differences are evened out via the randomization procedure. So you can feel confident that your IV caused your DV. That's different than random sample. Sometimes students get confused between a random sample and random assignment. For our purposes, think of random assignment as being associated with the formal experiment when you're trying to set up your experiment and you want to ensure that you can have confidence that your independent variable caused your dependent variable, or the change of your dependent variable. Random sample, on the other hand, is when every member in a population has an equal chance of being selected and used in a study. Okay, so if I was given a survey and I wanted to be able to generalize my findings to a large group of people, I would start off by defining what my population was. And then I would get a sample, a subset of the population, and I would actually survey that subset. And then whatever I found out from surveying that subset, I would generalize to the population. Well, the only way I can feel confident that when I make this generalization that it's legit is that this subset is actually a random sample. Because in a random sample, every member of the population had an equal chance of being selected and put into that group. So the random sample is a representative sample of the larger population. The random sample, the sample, is who you're going to actually study. Okay? But like I said, don't confuse random sample and random assignment. Two different things. All right. The video is up to 13 minutes, so that means I need to wrap it up. Please take a look and read over chapter 1. If you have questions, comments, compliments, or concerns, I'm here for you. And if someone will either make a comment on Canvas or here on YouTube and let me know what video you want me to do, I can, create a video just on that particular topic. Also, if you're not sure about something, you read something in our textbook and you're like, what did they mean by this? Go ahead and ask me. I've been teaching psychology for over 20 years now. I know a little bit about psych. And if I don't know the answer, then I'm happy to direct you to a place where you can get the answer. I have tons of books, tons of resources, and either I will find the answer and share it with you, or I would direct you to someone who could answer the question. So I think that's it. To Tyler.